Welcome back to Unplugged Headlines. I'm your host, and, we're jumping into episode 17 today.
17 already, huh? Time flies.
It really does. And this time we're tackling a pretty big one, the Corporate Transparency Act.
The CTA.
Yeah, the CTA. It's causing quite a stir in the business world.
Oh, absolutely. Lots of legal challenges popping up, and businesses, well, they're trying to figure out what it all means for them.
Right, exactly. It's a bit of a tangled web, wouldn't you say?
It definitely a web. Lots of layers to untangle for sure.
So, ready to dive in and try to make sense of it all.
Let's do it. You know, it's really a fascinating topic when you think about it. You've got this push for government transparency, but then there are concerns about, potential overreach.
And then, of course, we can't forget the whole the fight against financial crime.
Right, exactly. There's a lot at stake here.
Okay, so maybe we should start with the basics. What is the CTA actually trying to do? And why is it causing so much controversy?
Well, at its core, the CTA is trying to shine a light on those anonymous shell companies.
Shell companies, the ones we hear about in the news sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. They've been used for all sorts of shady stuff for years, money laundering, tax evasion, you name it.
So the CTA is basically trying to make it harder for those bad actors to hide.
Exactly. It's all about pulling back the curtain and forcing companies to disclose who really owns and controls them.
Well, more transparency in the business world.
That's the idea. Make things more accountable,
Yeah.
Level the playing field.
Okay, I see the logic there.
Yeah.
So how does this actually work in practice? What do companies have to do under the CTA?
Well, the main thing is most U.S. companies, LLCs, those kinds of entities, they need to report information about their beneficial owners to FinCEN.
FinCEN.
Yeah, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. We're talking names, addresses, dates of birth, ID numbers, that sort of thing.
Wow, that's a lot of personal information. Who has access to all that data?
That's a great question, and it's a big concern for a lot of people. The law does outline specific safeguards, though. So the database is mainly for law enforcement and regulatory agencies.
So they can use it for their investigations.
Right. And it's also accessible to financial institutions for, due diligence, like those KYC checks they do when they onboard near customers.
KYC, that's know your customer, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But accessing this information, it's strictly controlled. There are penalties for any unauthorized use.
So it's not like this information is just out there for anyone to see.
No, not at all. The idea is to find that balance, Transparency, yes, but also protecting sensitive information.
Right, that makes sense. Now, you said that most companies are subject to these requirements. Are there any exceptions?
Yes, absolutely. Some companies are exempt, mainly entities that are already under a lot of regulatory scrutiny.
Okay, so like
Publicly traded companies, for example, or big operating companies with substantial revenue, lots of employees. And heavily regulated financial institutions, those are exempt too.
Got it. So the focus is really on those smaller, less transparent companies.
Exactly. The ones where the risk of hiding something shady is higher.
Interesting. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
No. And it's not just about, doing the right thing either. There are penalties for not complying.
Ah, so there's a stick along with a carrot.
Exactly. We're talking some serious fines here, up to $500 a day for each violation. And even criminal charges for those who just blatantly ignore the law.
Wow, that definitely ups the ante.
Yeah, it shows you how serious the government is about this whole transparency thing.
So it seems pretty straightforward on the surface, right? Report the information or face the music. But I've heard there's been some pushback, some legal challenges to the CTA. What's going on there?
Yes. Well, that's where things get a little more complicated. The CTA's rollout, it's been anything but smooth.
You could say that again. So what's causing all the trouble?
Well, we've got lawsuits popping up all over, challenging the constitutionality of the law, the practicality of it, the whole 9 yards.
So who's leading the charge against the CTA?
Well, you've got small businesses, for one. They're feeling the pressure, saying that, the compliance burden is just too much.
Especially for those with limited resources.
Exactly. And they actually scored a pretty big win in a case called NFIB v. Yellen.
NFIB v. Yellen, what was that about?
Well, a federal judge actually issued a nationwide halt on the CTA's enforcement.
Nationwide halt?
Yeah.
Wow.
It was a big deal. It really highlights just how controversial this whole thing is.
And it's not just small businesses, right? I heard that the National Small Business Association also filed a lawsuit.
They did. NSBA v. FinCEN. Their big concern is, well, they're saying the government's overstepping its boundaries,
Yeah.
intruding into areas that, they're usually regulated by states.
So it's a states' rights issue.
Yeah, you could say that. And then there's Firestone v. Yellen, which was another case along those same lines. Individual plaintiffs, but same concerns about the government overreaching.
So we've got some courts siding with the challengers, others upholding the CTA. It's all a bit of a mixed bag, isn't it?
It is, and it creates a lot of uncertainty for everyone involved.
Absolutely. So what are the big legal questions at the heart of all this? What are the courts really grappling with?
Well, it boils down to some pretty fundamental constitutional issues, like does the government's need for transparency outweigh individual privacy rights?
That's a big one.
It is. We're talking a Fourth Amendment stuff here.
Right.
The right to be secure in your papers and effects.
Right, the right to privacy.
Yeah.
So how do you balance that with the need to investigate financial crimes?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a tough one, and the courts are definitely wrestling with it. And then there's the whole issue of federal power versus states' rights.
Right, we touched on that earlier. So is the CTA, is it really within the federal government's authority?
That's what everyone's trying to figure out. You've got the Commerce Clause on one hand, which gives Congress the power to regulate, interstate commerce. And then you've got the 10th Amendment, which reserves all those powers not specifically given to the federal government, to the states.
So it's a bit of a tug of war.
We could say that.
Yeah.
And then there's the concern that, well, the CTA's rules are just too vague.
Vague, how so?
Well, it could lead to inconsistent enforcement. A company might be following the rules in one state, but then run into trouble in another. It's a lot of uncertainty for businesses.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a problem. So we've got this complex legal battle playing out, and businesses are kind of stuck in the middle. How are they supposed to prepare for something when the rules themselves are still being challenged?
Well, that's the real challenge, isn't it? And that's exactly what we're going to dig into next. Welcome back. We're still wading through this Corporate Transparency Act, trying to figure out what it all means for businesses.
It really is a wild ride, isn't it? You've got constitutional rights clashing with government authority, privacy concerns. It's a lot.
It is. It really shows you how complex this whole issue of transparency is. We need it to fight financial crime, but at the same time, we have to protect individual rights, make sure the government isn't overreaching.
And as we were talking about before, this legal uncertainty makes it really tough for businesses. How can they prepare for a law that's still being challenged in court?
That's the big question, isn't it? But even with all this back and forth, there are still some key insights businesses can take away, some steps they can start taking now, no matter what happens with the legal challenges.
Okay, that's good to hear. So what's the first step?
Well, the most important thing is to stay informed. Don't just bury your head in the sand and hope it all goes away,
So knowledge is power, especially in this case.
Absolutely. The more you understand about the legal developments, the announcements from FinCEN, all that, the better you can adapt and come up with a solid compliance strategy.
Right, a strategy. So beyond staying informed, what else can businesses do to get ready?
Well, I think it's a good time to take a look at your corporate structure. If you're relying on those complex structures, multiple layers, offshore entities, that sort of thing, it might be time to simplify.
You're saying greater transparency might mean less complexity.
Could be. Simpler structures are generally, they're just easier to manage when it comes to transparency regulations. And then there's the data issue. This is a big one. The CTA really puts the spotlight on data governance.
Data governance meaning?
Meaning you need to have strong systems in place to collect, store, and protect all that sensitive, beneficial ownership information.
Right, because we talked about the security of the FinCEN database, but businesses also have a responsibility to protect the data they collect.
Absolutely. We're talking encryption, access controls, regular audits, all the best practices for keeping sensitive information safe. And don't be afraid to reach out to your peers, other businesses in your industry.
Strength in numbers.
Yeah. You can share best practices, talk about the challenges you're facing, maybe even collaborate on compliance solutions.
It's always easier when you're not going it alone. Yeah.
Right. And don't forget about advocacy. By working together, you can really amplify your voice. You can join industry associations, work with advocacy groups, try to influence those future regulatory changes, push for solutions that are more workable, more balanced.
So even though the future of the CTA is still up in the air, there are things businesses can do to prepare. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about something you mentioned earlier, the impact of the CTA on efforts to fight financial crime, specifically those KYC and AML initiatives.
Oh, yeah. That's a big part of this whole conversation. Know your customer, anti-money laundering. These are the front lines in the fight against financial crime. And the CTA, well, it has the potential to really shake things up.
How so?
Well, by forcing companies to be transparent about their beneficial ownership, it makes it a lot harder for criminals to hide behind those shell companies. They can't just use them to launder money or, to fund terrorism without anyone knowing who's really behind it.
So it's all about connecting those dots.
Exactly. And for financial institutions, this is huge. I mean, they're the ones who are responsible for doing those KYC checks, verifying customer identities, making sure no one's doing anything shady.
So the CTA basically makes their jobs easier.
In some ways, yes. They'll have access to a lot more information about beneficial ownership, so they can identify those high-risk individuals and entities more easily.
So they can stop them from using the financial system for illegal purposes.
Right. But it's not all sunshine and roses. This also means financial institutions are going to have to deal with a lot more data. They'll need to invest in new systems, train their staff to handle this new level of complexity.
So it's a double-edged sword.
It is. More transparency is great for fighting financial crime, but it also creates new challenges. And we have to think about the impact on smaller businesses, too. Yeah, the ones that don't have the same resources as those big financial institutions.
Right, because they'll still have to comply with all these new rules.
Exactly. And that could mean stricter customer identification procedures, more due diligence, all sorts of things that can add to the cost of compliance.
So more transparency, but also more burden.
It's a trade-off for sure. And it's why it's so important for regulators to provide clear guidance, offer support, maybe even consider a phased implementation. Give those smaller businesses a little more time to adapt.
So businesses need to be proactive, but regulators need to be they need to be understanding, too.
Absolutely. And businesses, they shouldn't wait till the last minute to figure this all out. They should talk to their lawyers, get some advice on how to create a compliance strategy that works for them.
Okay, so we've covered the legal challenges, the practical considerations for businesses, the impact on the fight against financial crime. It's a lot to take in. But what about the bigger picture? How does the CTA fit into the global landscape of corporate transparency?
Ah, yes. The CTA isn't happening in isolation, It's a part of a much bigger trend. All over the world, governments are pushing for more transparency.
So the U.S. isn't alone in this.
No, not at all. In fact, the CTA is kind of bringing the U.S. more in line with international standards, like the European Union's fifth anti-money laundering directive. They also require beneficial ownership reporting.
So we're playing catch-up.
In a way, yes. And this global push for transparency, it's going to have some interesting consequences. For example, we might see more international cooperation in investigations, law enforcement and regulators from different countries sharing information.
Because if everyone's following the same rules, it's easier to track down the bad guys.
Exactly. And that could mean more efficient investigations. Instead of wasting time on dead-end leads, they can focus on the really high-risk cases.
So less time chasing ghosts, more time catching criminals.
You got it.
Huh.
But this increased transparency also means higher stakes for businesses. If they don't comply with both U.S. and international regulations, they could face some serious consequences: fines, reputational damage, even being shut out of certain markets.
So the message is clear: compliance is more important than ever.
Absolutely. And it's not just about avoiding penalties. It's about building trust with your customers, your partners, the regulators. Transparency is becoming, it's becoming a sign of a trustworthy business.
Right. It's not just about following the law. It's about doing business the right way.
Exactly.
Now, before we wrap things up, I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier, the constitutional challenges to the CTA. We've covered the practical implications for businesses, but let's dig a little deeper into those legal arguments.
Oh, yeah. That's where it gets really interesting, the battle between legal principles and government power. Welcome back to Unplugged Headlines. We're in the final stretch, our deep dive into the Corporate Transparency Act, and let's face it, it's been a real roller coaster ride so far.
It has. We've covered so much ground, from the law's intent and those controversial rollout issues to the legal battles that are still going on, and the impact on, well, everything from preventing financial crime to those global transparency standards.
Absolutely.
It's amazing to me how one piece of legislation can have such a far-reaching impact on the business world, touching on everything from constitutional rights to global trends.
Yeah, it really is.
But let's bring it all home now for our listeners.
Yeah.
What are the key takeaways from all this?
Oh, yeah.
And what should businesses be doing to prepare for the future, no matter how these legal challenges actually play out?
Well, one thing's for sure, the era of corporate secrecy, it's fading fast. The Corporate Transparency Act, it's really a prime example of this global shift towards more transparency. Businesses, they need to adapt to this new reality.
So no more hiding behind those anonymous shell companies.
Exactly. The days of using those shadowy entities to obscure financial dealings, they're numbered. And honestly, that's a good thing. It makes it much harder for criminals to launder money, to evade taxes, to finance terrorism.
But as we've discussed, this increased transparency, it comes with its own set of challenges, right?
It does.
Businesses, they need to be ready for that added compliance burden.
Absolutely. And that means well, it means understanding the new reporting requirements, having the systems in place to manage all that data, getting legal advice to make sure they're doing everything by the book.
It's a lot to handle, especially when the regulatory landscape is constantly changing.
It is.
Any advice for businesses that are feeling a little lost in the woods right now?
Well, first of all, don't panic. Take a deep breath and really take some time to understand the CTA and what it means for your specific business. There's a lot of information out there. Guidance from FinCEN, insights from industry associations, analysis from legal experts. Use those resources.
So knowledge is the first line of defense.
Exactly. The more you know, the better prepared you'll be to create a solid compliance strategy, one that really fits your needs.
And as you mentioned before, don't be afraid to reach out to your peers.
Absolutely. Talking to other businesses in your industry, sharing best practices, discussing the challenges you're facing, maybe even collaborating on solutions, it can make a huge difference.
Strength in numbers.
Exactly. And don't forget about the power of collective action, working with industry associations, advocacy groups, that kind of thing. You can actually have a voice in shaping those future regulatory changes, pushing for solutions that are more workable, more balanced.
Right, making your voice heard.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's technology.
Tech.
It's going to be a crucial tool for businesses that are trying to keep up with the CTA's demands. Think about, software solutions that can automate data collection, verification, reporting, all that stuff.
So use those tech tools to streamline the process and make things a little easier.
Exactly. Investing in those tools now can save you a lot of headaches down the road.
Well, it seems like even with all the uncertainty surrounding the CTA, businesses really can't afford to wait and see what happens. They need to be proactive, stay informed, and get some expert guidance.
I couldn't agree more. And remember, it's not just about checking boxes and avoiding fines. It's about doing business the right way, building trust with your customers, your partners, the regulators. Transparency, it's becoming the hallmark of a truly reputable business.
That's a great point. It's about ethics as much as it is about legality. Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive into the Corporate Transparency Act. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a thought to ponder. Even if the CTA goes through some changes, or even if there are delays, that global trend towards greater transparency, it's not going away. How might this impact your industry or even your own investments? It's something to think about as we move forward in this ever-evolving business world. Thanks for joining us on Unplugged Headlines.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the fight against financial crime, it's a team effort. We all have a role to play in making the business world a more transparent and accountable place.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay ahead of the curve.